Connected by purpose, driven by passion. This is Children's Healthcare Canada's Spark Live webinar series.
Children's Healthcare Canada would like to thank the following Keystone funding partners for their ongoing contributions that support all of our programs and activities: the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation, BC Children's Hospital Foundation, the Children's Hospital at London Health Sciences Centre, the Alberta Children's Hospital Foundation, the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, and Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. We would also like to thank the organizations that provide funding for our knowledge translation activities, which includes this Spark Live webinar series, the Spark Conversations blog, and the Knowledge Exchange Network. To learn more about Children's Healthcare Canada, you can go to our website, follow us on Twitter or Facebook, or you can sign up for our weekly Spark newsletter at childrenshealthcarecanada.ca/email, where you will learn about upcoming events, read the latest posts from our blog, and other exciting news and events from across the child and youth healthcare community.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Children's Healthcare Canada's Spark Live webinar series. I'm Doug Maynard, your host for the next hour or so. Spark Live is where we gather each Wednesday to curate and convene and showcase excellence and innovation from across the child and youth healthcare community, with our goal to spark conversation, ideas, and action. And since we are live, I want to remind everyone that you do have the opportunity to type questions into the question box at any time for our presenters. We'll check for questions throughout the session, so please don't feel you need to wait until the end of the presentations. If you have a question, just type it in as you think of it, and then we'll have them ready for our presenters when they're ready to take them. And also, always feel free to share your thoughts on Twitter, and be sure to tag us at Child Health Can. And before we get to today's session, I do want to mention that this is the time of year where we start thinking about the Children's Healthcare Canada Annual Conference. This year, just for those of you who have been at our conference in the past, it's always been in October. This year is different because of the election, which is of course the topic of today's webinar. Because of the election, we moved it. So our conference this year in Ottawa at the Westin downtown in Ottawa will be December 8th to the 10th. Registration is open. The early bird deadline has passed, but there's still lots of time to register. The program's up on the website, which you can find at our website at childrenshealthcarecanada.ca. There's a link at the top that goes to our conference site, or you can go there directly at conference.childrenshealthcarecanada.ca. So hopefully we'll get a chance to see lots of our Spark Live audience in person at that conference. All right, so on to today's session, which is titled Election 2019, Getting Kids Back on the Radar. And today we're going to hear from three of our partners, along with Children's Healthcare Canada, to give our audience a sense of the breadth of child health issues that we at Children's Healthcare Canada are interested in, but also what some of our partners, our other partners, are also working on. And really our main goal here is to provide you with information and resources so that you might be better prepared to have conversations, or maybe even seek out opportunities to influence the potential candidates in this upcoming election, to think about and get them to think about and recognize the importance of children and children's health issues and make it an important election issue. It's not really on any of the current party platforms right now, but this is our opportunity to, as you have those opportunities to interact with those candidates from all parties, to get them thinking about children and get children, as we're saying in the title, get kids back on the radar. And all of the partners today, including Children's Healthcare Canada, have some resources that are going to help you with those interactions. And we'll be showing those throughout the session. But before we get to those, we're going to have a bit of opening presentations from each of our presenters. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panel. I'm going to introduce everyone right up front here, and then we'll just go straight into the presentations. So with us today, we have Sara Austin from Children's First Canada. Sara is a champion for children with more than 20 years of Canadian and international experience, and is the founder and CEO of Children's First Canada. And she leads a national movement to make Canada the best place in the world for kids to grow up. We also have Lisa Wolff from UNICEF Canada, and Lisa is Director of Policy and Research at UNICEF Canada, and her mission is to promote public policy and practices in Canada that align with the principles and standards of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And we also have Adele Davis from the Canadian Pediatric Society. Adele has been the Executive Director of the Canadian Pediatric Society since 1999. And the CPS is a national advocacy organization committed to the health needs of children and youth. And we also have with us Emily Gruenwoldt, our very own Emily Gruenwoldt, President and CEO of Children's Healthcare Canada. And Emily is also the Executive Director of the Pediatric Chairs of Canada. So a great panel today. lots of opportunity to ask these real true leaders in children's health issues broadly, not just healthcare, but health issues across the span. So it's a great opportunity to ask questions of these people who have a broad oversight of a lot of the issues that might be of interest to our potential candidates. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to hand the virtual podium first off over to Sara Austin. Over to you, Sara.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those on the East Coast. Doug, are my slides showing up clearly?
Yep, they are. They look great.
All right. Well, as Doug said, Children First Canada has a bold and ambitious vision of making Canada the best place in the world for kids to grow up. We were founded in 2015 and launched in 2016, and Children First Canada brings together Canada's leading children's charities, hospitals, research centres, major corporations, parents, teachers, and kids themselves. And our focus really has been around building public awareness, convincing Canadians that there is a problem facing our children, and mobilizing key stakeholders to take action, particularly through engaging our federal government, but also engaging the Canadian public in taking action. We launched in 2015 with our landmark report, The Kids Are Not All Right, and have continued to do public campaigning since that time. And we're thrilled to have Children's Healthcare Canada as one of our key partners, and Emily as a member of our Council of Champions. When we first started, it was really important for our work to be leveraging the key data around the health and well-being of Canada's kids as we try and confront this myth that Canada's a world-leading country for kids, and trying to build public awareness and mobilize action. And we were thrilled in 2018 to build a partnership with the O'Brien Institute for Public Health at the University of Calgary, and to launch our first Raising Canada report that was launched last fall as kids headed back to school, and really trying to harness some of the key data on the health and well-being of children, and release that with a major public campaign last fall. It was followed up by a report last fall with economic commentary, where we looked at the cost of maintaining the status quo and really trying to build the business case for taking action. So this year, as we were preparing to head into election year, we're really trying to engage our federal government and the Canadian public around these issues. We looked at how we could continue to build on the 2018 Raising Canada report and continue to take action. So we took some of those key leading facts and figures on the health and well-being of children, and we're trying to find ways to continue to mobilize action. I'm just struggling here to change the slides, Doug. For some reason, I'm not getting the pop-up for advancing the slides.
You should just be able to advance the slides just like you normally would, whether it's cursor keys or return key or mouse clicks. That should advance the slide.
It's not giving me that option. I'm clicking all the buttons and it's not, nothing's going.
If you just take your mouse, actually what we'll do is we'll take control back here. Just try that again. Just give it back to you again.
All right, thank you.
So maybe it just sort of froze or something. So there, if you want to just show your screen again, we'll just try that one more time. Just flip to the next slide.
Yeah, I'm clicking, but it's not advancing for some reason.
Is your perhaps your PowerPoint is frozen? If you can maybe just minimize your slides and just try that again, like go out of slideshow mode.
Just give me 1 second, sorry. Are you seeing that now?
That we can see the next slide now. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Sorry for the delay. So this year's report, really looking at as we head into the federal election, knowing that kids can't vote, we're looking for ways to still make the ideas and opinions and the key concerns of children central to the election. We know that kids represent a quarter of our population and 100% of our future, and trying to really amplify the voices of children and youth. As many of you may know, in 2018, we launched the final version of the Canadian Children's Charter. The Charter brought together the views of thousands of children and youth from coast to coast to coast, where they created their own plan of action to make Canada a world-leading country for kids. And so we looked at the input that came through the Canadian Children's Charter, as well as the research that came through the previous Raising Canada report, and pulled that all together in this year's report. So we this year took a focus on the top 10 threats to Canada's children, really trying to put a spotlight on the huge concerns facing the health and well-being of our children, and harnessing some of that key data. We highlighted, for instance, accidents and preventable injuries as the #1 threat to kids in Canada, knowing that those are the leading causes of death for children in our country. We highlighted suicide, depression, and anxiety, knowing that mental health concerns are a significant concern based on the scientific data, but also on the concerns that children themselves are speaking about. And suicide in particular being the second leading cause of death for children in our country. Child abuse was highlighted as #3, knowing that fully 1/3 of Canada's kids has experienced some form of child abuse by the age of 16. And this not only the impact of trauma on childhood and their health today, but also the long-term impacts to health for children as they become adolescents and grow into adults. Poverty was also highlighted as a key concern. Certainly, we've seen over the past year a significant improvement in the overall data for numbers of children living in poverty as a result of the child tax benefit and other interventions to try and lift children out of poverty, but still knowing that well between 9 to 12% of kids are growing up in poverty, and for First Nations children in particular, 50% growing up in poverty. Infant mortality was again highlighted as a key concern, particularly given how Canada ranks compared to other OECD countries around the world, and also especially the huge disparities for children in the north and the high numbers of infant deaths in northern Canada. Obesity and physical inactivity highlighted as a concern, given that 1/4 of Canada's kids are growing up obese or overweight, and 1/3 are not meeting their daily physical activity guidelines. Food insecurity being highlighted again as a concern, given that more than 10% of families with children under the age of 6 experience food insecurity, and the impact that has for kids' health today, but also for their longer-term health outcomes. Vaccine preventable illnesses being a concern, knowing that a significant number of children are not vaccinated, 25% are not vaccinated fully by the age of 2. And knowing that vaccines are the most cost-effective health intervention available, that again, this is a significant concern for a large number of kids in our country. We highlighted discrimination as another concern, knowing that based on data available from World Health Organization, and knowing that such a significant number of kids in our country are experiencing worse health outcomes for the First Nations, Inuit, or Métis children, racialized children, but also children with disabilities and other parts of the population who experience different forms of discrimination are more likely to grow up in poverty, be more likely to experience child abuse and other child health concerns. And lastly, we highlighted bullying as a key concern. Certainly, this is an issue that children themselves are talking about and raising as a concern around their physical and mental health, but also clearly the data points to the high numbers of children being impacted, with more than 10% of children experiencing bullying online, and 1 in 5 kids experiencing cyberstalking, cyberbullying, or both. So that just gives you a quick snapshot of the key issues that we were raising. The report was coupled with a call to action endorsed by our Council of Champions, with all the leaders of these major organizations supporting children's issues, and really calling on action on the part of the federal government, but also on the part of Canadians. So with the federal government, we rather than getting into the weeds on each of the 10 issues, we highlighted 3 recommendations where we could really make headway on all fronts. So as many of you may know, we've continued to be campaigning for a federal commission for children and youth, to have somebody independent in government advancing the health and well-being of children and protecting the rights of our children. We've highlighted the need for a pan-Canadian strategy for children and youth. knowing that there's a policy vacuum at the federal level, but also huge disparities and gaps from one province to the next. And seeing the opportunity to really bring our federal and provincial territorial governments together under one overarching strategy, so that wherever kids grow up in our country, that they have access to equitable supports and services. And lastly, be focused on the need for a children's budget. This is, again, something that we and many others have been campaigning for years. We saw some headway with this in the 2019 federal budget with the publishing of the Young Canadians Budget Analysis, but we see a huge opportunity to take that further. And again, seeing these three recommendations as issues that should be crossing all party lines, and where we are seeking support from all the major federal political parties. The report garnered a massive amount of media coverage. We had 4 solid days of media headlines, national and regional news that garnered over 233 million media impressions. So clearly there's, again, continued interest in these issues on the part of the Canadian public, and again, an opportunity to be raising awareness and mobilizing Canadians to take action. You know, we know, again, because kids can't vote, that they're not able to be heard in some of these key decisions, but adults who can vote and who are hearing about these issues are hopefully taking the opportunity to speak up and engage their local candidates. We were really pleased to see the headline on the Toronto Star recently about election 2019 being all about our children. And while that's a great aspiration, you know, that remains to be seen as to whether that will in fact be true. And that's where the Raising Canada campaign and the work of the other partners presenting this morning is really important, that we really need to keep the pressure up as we head towards election day and keep the momentum going. We've released with our report a platform monitoring. I won't get into the details of that now, but we're continuing to update our website with analysis of where each of the parties stand, so that Canadians know where the parties stand. And you know, currently there are some fairly significant gaps in the policy analysis, and we are working through the public pressure to help push the parties to take more action and fill in those gaps and make some solid promises to our children. All of the resources that came out with the report, including the call to action, the election toolkit, a social media toolkit, and the platform analysis, as well as the previous Raising Canada reports, are all on our website, childrenfirstcanada.com. And so encourage folks to go online and download those and make good use of them. In particular, we've highlighted different ways that Canadians can be taking action. You know, engaging with federal leaders and tagging them on social media, asking them questions, engaging with candidates in your riding, spreading the news and continuing to raise awareness, keeping informed, particularly as parties update their policy platforms. And also we want to highlight the need to involve children in this, you know, in the election. While kids can't vote, their opinions matter, and we want kids to be able to speak about these issues. And so we're encouraging adults to engage their kids and teens and youth on these issues, and encourage them to share their views on social media and in other creative ways. We put together an election toolkit that you can download from the website. And again, this provides you with questions so that when candidates come knocking on your door, or as you head into candidate forums, that you have those resources at hand and have a summary of the top 10 themes, as well as questions that you can be asking. We have a couple of upcoming events talking about this research and engaging Canadians, one in Toronto and another in Calgary, and forums in the morning in each of these cities with children and youth, and then with adult leaders. And we encourage you, if you're in either of those cities, to join us at the events. We have a Twitter chat coming up this Sunday with Ann Douglas, a leading parenting expert, again, trying to build momentum and get Canadians talking about these issues and engaging with their candidates. And that really brings me to the end of the summary of the Raising Canada report. We get into some of the further details around some recent polling results, as well as where each of the parties stand following the next presenters, and happy to take some questions later in the presentation. Thank you.
Yes, Sarah, great presentation. And there is a link in the chat box to take you to some of those resources that Sara was just mentioning on their website at childrenfirstcanada.com. Specifically that Raising Canada section that has a lot of the resources, the party tracker and all of that other information that Sara just presented. So thank you very much for that. So we're going to continue on sort of setting the context and what we know about the current state of child health and well-being in Canada. And we're going to now move sort of from Calgary to Toronto, I believe that's where you are, Lisa, is in Toronto. Lisa Wolff from UNICEF Canada is going to talk to us about their 2019 Canadian Index of Child and Youth Wellbeing. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Doug. And hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to join you today to share some new insights from our brand new Canadian Index of Child and Youth Wellbeing at a time when political parties and voters have some really big opportunities and big decisions to address some very big challenges. And many of you may be familiar with the UNICEF Report Card series, which has documented the state of children and youth in Canada and across rich countries for a generation now, more than 18 years. But the index is a new tool to more deeply understand what it's like to grow up in Canada, and in particular from the point of view of children and youth, as well as some other status indicators that you might expect to see in an index. And, it may not surprise you to know that Canada is one of the world's wealthiest economies, but it's still surprising that many Canadians believe Canada must be one of the best places to be a child. And I'll leave it to you, at the end of my presentation to decide if you would agree with that. Really, the Canadian Index of Child and Youth Wellbeing is a tool to help answer that question. How great are we, and where do we stand when it comes to the well-being of our children and youth? So we just launched this, again, a couple of weeks ago, September 3rd. The index has 125 headline indicators of the state of children and youth, and we're using the most recent national statistical data to do this. We also have disaggregated data where it's available by region and gender and other dimensions of childhood. And the intent is really to take the pulse of, again, what it's like to be a young person growing up here from birth to age 18 and across 9 interrelated dimensions of life. And the data provides a baseline, and certainly this first index report is a baseline. It's a profile of children from which we're going to measure trends and hopefully progress in future iterations. And in doing so, help focus on some of our greatest challenges. Where are we not making progress? Where are we falling backward? And in one of the world's wealthiest societies, what we're finding in the data is, unfortunately, it's still necessary to measure how well Canada is meeting the very basic needs of children and youth, because we're not meeting them, like nutrition and clean water. But also in wealthy countries, as everywhere, child and youth well-being is really fundamentally determined by how young people feel about their lives, their own sense of well-being. And they do see life and childhood very differently than many adults do. They tell us how important their pets are as a relationship and what poverty feels like when you're a kid. So about 60% of the indicators in the index are self-reported by young people. And we certainly can't measure everything that matters, but it's a pretty big selfie of Canada. And I'm just going to share some really brief snapshots of some of the findings that really stand out. They stood out to us. And I would ask you to consider how you would answer these questions on the slide as we go. So our first dimension of well-being is happiness, and together with young people, we asked the question: are we happy as young people? And if there's one thing that really stood out to us in the findings, it's the discouraging number of children and youth who say they are very happy. And we measure this through a life satisfaction scale. And children's life satisfaction is a really good overall indicator of their well-being. If I had to choose one of those 125 indicators, it would be this one. It's well-being from their perspective, an overall take. And during a time of life that we would like to think is happy and relatively carefree, it is troubling that so few kids give their life an A. And in fact, when you ask parents, what is their greatest priority for their children, the majority say happiness. So it's a reasonable benchmark, to be measuring. So why are children relatively unhappy? children's sense of well-being is really heavily conditioned by the quality of their close relationships, and we're measuring some aspects of that in the index. I think it's notable that for just over half of kids, they say that they feel well supported by their families, and less than half report a positive relationship with teachers. So 1 in 4 feel lonely and excluded in life. Are we secure? I mean, can money buy happiness? And what we're finding is, freedom from poverty is certainly linked to young people's overall sense of well-being. But a lot of kids today in materially secure, more advantaged families are pretty unhappy. So by one measure, 1 in 10 young people lives in families without enough income to meet even their basic needs, like safe and secure housing and food security. And Sara mentioned that. And this is kind of a low watermark in terms of measuring poverty in a rich country. And the index is asking a bigger question. Do children and youth have the resources and opportunities that they need, not only to meet their basic needs, but to grow up great? And using a measure that's standard to measure poverty across wealthy countries, 20% of Canada's children live in low income, which is it's a measure that is a good measure of opportunity to participate normally in society, which has a big influence on how kids feel about their lives. So 20% live below, a level of income, household income, where they would have opportunities to participate normally. And that compares unfavorably with better performing countries like Denmark and Norway, who have half that rate. And I think it's interesting that close to half of young people report that their families are well off. If you ask them, do you feel well off? Do you have the resources you need to live a good life? And I think it's interesting because it coincides with the number who say they're happy. And what that's telling us is that a substantial number of young people above the poverty line do not feel well off when they're looking across society and assessing, the comparative status of them and their families. And that actually has a bigger impact on their sense of well-being than actual household income, which is the usual way we measure poverty. Are we protected? Canadians may not agree on how happy or materially secure we expect children to be, but every one of us, I think, agrees that children should be protected from violence, and violence has no place in childhood. But our children experience relatively high levels of violence, and often with the people and places most familiar to them. So compared to many rich countries, our kids experience more bullying and fighting. About 1 in 3 have fairly regular experiences of bullying and fighting, and they're more likely to be victims of homicide. And those patterns of violence may help explain why young people are reporting relatively low support from family and at school, where a lot of bullying takes place, and follows them online. I think most people, young people, do report feeling safe from crime in their communities, and relatively few experience violent crime, if that's good news. Turning to what most adults in Canada focus on, which is, are kids learning and are they healthy? I mean, when you ask adults what's most important about how kids are faring, that's usually what you hear. So we look at that, and we have some mixed signals. And in terms of learning, I think, it's welcome that Canada is one of the highest ranking rich countries, as we have been for a while, in terms of overall, levels of achievement in school. Our kids are getting good grades, and our schools produce a lot of equity. But behind the good grades, the education journey is very difficult for many young people, and more than half say school is not a positive experience. 1 in 4 say they have way too much schoolwork for the time that they have available. So they're getting A's at school, but in life they're not giving life an A. When it comes to health, we have lots of different sentinel indicators in the index of health that many of you will be familiar with, and Sara certainly addressed a number of them, everything from obesity to breastfeeding, immunization, across birth to age 18. But I think some of the the indicators that do invite the question, are we focused on the things that really matter, or at least some of the things that really matter? And we give a lot of attention to youth drug use for good reason. But we're finding in a risk index that it's really, a problem in terms of frequent high-risk drug use that's fairly limited to 7.2% of 14 and 15-year-olds. But as many as 1 in 3 young people report weekly symptoms of distress, sort of psychosomatic symptoms, if you will, like headaches and stomach aches and problems sleeping. I think that gets much less attention. And overall, when you ask kids, how is your health? Just 3/4 say their health status is very good or excellent. And again, that's at a time of life when people should be the healthiest, and it becomes increasingly evident that social and economic conditions have a major influence on health conditions. So moving along, are we free to play? In addition to happiness, one of the best overall indicators of child and youth well-being is their freedom just to be kids, the freedom to play. And we find that a lot of young people are not playing enough. They're not spending enough time playing. And by late adolescence, they're facing a lot of competing demands on their time. And we saw that with some of the school-related data. And fewer than 1 in 10 are meeting the movement guidelines, balancing physical activity and screen time and sleeping. Frankly, screen time gets a lot of the blame, but, when you ask young people why they're spending time on screens or why they're feeling fatigued in the morning, you start to hear things like, well, school start times are too early, or I feel a lot of stress and I stay up late on my screen just to distress. It's time really to look behind some of these lead indicators, in terms of what the real problems are. Are we connected to the environment? This is an interesting dimension of life because, kids are part of our ecosystems. These are not indicators that you tend to see in child and youth well-being measurement. Increasingly, we do around the world. And we look here at some of the very basics, having air to breathe and water to drink. And there are maybe some surprises in a country like Canada with big open spaces and lots of natural resources, that children and youth in cities are living just under the safe limit for fine particulate air pollution, which is linked to all sorts of health challenges. And in the most recent year that we have data for, 1 in 10 homes with children were under a boil water advisory, much more persistent in Indigenous communities, but affecting a lot of children and youth. And we can't adequately track how kids are being affected by increasing human environment disasters. There's not sufficient data, but thanks to the Canadian Pediatric Society for recently calling this out. And we raise the questions about the cost of these disasters. I mean, it's estimated that Canada's spending more than $1 billion a year to pay for disasters. Can you imagine, what that could do to provide childcare or lift children out of poverty if we spent that money? And finally, are we participating? Given the economic and social and environmental changes affecting their lives, it wouldn't be news to you that kids across this country are taking to the streets in protest, in relation to climate change, sexual health education. They want to be part of a participatory dialogue on the issues we're hearing in this election and others. They work, they pay taxes. None has the right to vote, although they can join political parties at 14 and decide on candidates. We just don't normalize listening to kids in this country as we do in some other countries. So, we come full circle around the index and ask, what is going on here? Why are we seeing some of these signals? I think what's become very clear to us, and I think in the emerging research, is that income inequality is shaping this generation of children. They are the ones that have grown up with a sharp increase in income inequality. It affects children's happiness. It seems to affect many dimensions of life because it comes with poorer health outcomes and more violence in countries with higher income inequality. Countries with less income equality tend to have worse child and youth well-being outcomes. So when it comes to what to do about that, UNICEF's Vote for Every Child campaign really focuses on the policies we think could have the greatest impact, would be the most equalizing, to work against income inequality, to start early in early childhood doing that, to close gaps for children and put children at the center of government. And you can see more on our website, Vote for Every Child, and I think we'll talk further about it at this in the next section when we come to election priorities. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Another excellent presentation from both of you, really highlighting what the issues are. I mean, when you put them all on the screen like that in one spot, it's really quite shocking when you we think of Canada as being a great country. And when we really see the challenges that children here are facing, it's really quite shocking. So thank you for really helping us set the stage for why this is an important issue. So now we're going to move on and really talk a little bit more about this section is about how the federal parties measure up on priorities and policies for kids. So for that, we're going to first go over to Marie-Adele Davis here in Ottawa with the Canadian Pediatric Society. Over to you, Marie-Adele. Marie-Adele, are you on mute?
I am on mute. Can you hear me now? I just wanted to check that my slides were up.
Yep, they are. Yep.
Perfect. So thank you very much to Sara and Lisa for setting the stage as to what we as child and youth health advocates and professionals know are vitally important to be talking about during this election. What I'm going to talk about now is what the political parties and the political leaders are actually talking about. Because ideally, they would be talking about what we know is important. Now, when we first started to talk about doing this webinar about 2 months ago, we assumed that the parties would have, and now, Doug, I'm having the same trouble that Sara had where my slides are not advancing.
Yeah, just try sort of going out of the slideshow real quick and then just restarting the slideshow.
Okay.
Just with your PowerPoint. We'll see if that fixes it.
Oh, that did it. You're a genius from afar. Thank you. So as I said, 2 months ago we said we would do this webinar on election priorities, we assumed that the election platforms would actually be available from all of the major parties and that we would be able to share with you what was in those platforms that related to children and youth and our priorities. I will say as a note, all of us who work for child advocacy organizations need to be incredibly careful about how we present what is in the different platforms, because we cannot be seen as partisan. So we can only say what is in there. Publicly, we can't actually tell you whether we think one is better than another. However, that does not really come into play today because only the New Democrats and the Green parties have actually made their official party platforms public to date. So neither the Conservative Party of Canada nor the Liberal Party of Canada, and it's the same for the Bloc and the People's Party, have yet to publish their priorities. So then how do we know, because the election is only a month out, what some of those priorities might be? And then we really turn to the news cycle. And these are headlines from yesterday. If I was to do this slide tonight, there would probably be other headlines where different parties were announcing priorities or plans that would potentially positively impact children and youth in this country. And as everybody knows, during the election, most of these announcements, I didn't put the visuals, I just put the headlines. But if I was to share the picture, somebody would be standing at a podium in the middle of a sport field with kids playing behind, or they would be, talking to a toddler in a childcare setting, or some visual where children were involved. So we know the parties like to talk about kids during the election, that's for sure. How do we actually make them live up to those promises? one way you can actually, excuse me, see what the different parties have spoken about to date during this election is if you go to Canada Votes 2019, they are following the news cycle and updating the different, I think right now they have 6 different priorities there, including healthcare, including gun control, things that we know would positively impact kids if done the right way. And so it can give you a sense of what the different parties are actually saying, given that they have not made their platforms public to date. So some of the issues that are important to us as child and youth advocates. I'm just going to highlight some of what's been said so far. As Sara said, many of us for a number of years have felt that the establishment of a Child and Youth Commissioner or a Child and Youth Commission would be of great benefit at the federal level. Unfortunately, at this point in time, it's only been positively mentioned in the Green Party platform. We don't know if it will come out in the Liberal platform. We don't know if it will come out in the Conservative platform. In terms of pharmacare, which is something near and dear to the Canadian Pediatric Society and Children's Healthcare Canada, and there's going to be a webinar specifically on it next week. While many of the parties have spoken in some way, shape, or form about universal pharmacare, none of them have been specific as to how to do it best to ensure the needs of Canadian kids are met. Firearms control is something that the Canadian Pediatric Society is making a priority during this election. And again, you can see from my brief comments on the slide that really the parties are all over the map. And again, with poverty reduction, everybody announces that they've got the magic bullet as to how we're going to reduce, hopefully one day eradicate poverty in Canada. But every party seems to be announcing a different measure. And I'll be honest, I'm not an economist, so I can't answer any questions as to what may be in the best interest of kids. And again, for mental health, everybody talks about it, but there haven't been any specifics about what we really need to do to support the young people. And as Lisa mentioned in her presentation, our kids are not feeling like their mental health is as good as we would all want it to be. So this really needs to be a key area moving forward. How are some other ways to get answers about the issues that are important to us, important to any of you? You can write to the parties. CPS has written to all of the parties, asking them questions about our major priorities. When we get those answers, we will be posting them in the election section of our website. Many of them will answer, and it's something that once they answer, you can actually use to help hold them accountable once the election is over. You can ask through the media. Samantha Grills, who is the advocacy specialist here at CPS, wrote a question to the CBC to ask where the different parties stood on gun control and got an answer because they went and analyzed the different platforms, the different the different announcements that had been made by the parties. And then we're able to share that with our members so that they know where the different parties are standing. You can look to see if there's some way to get one of your issues raised at one of the leaders' debates. There are different ways to do that. At a local level, you can absolutely attend a candidates meeting, all candidates meetings, ask questions. I think all of us have different questions that are up on our website that can be asked around our key priority issues, especially if you live in the riding of somebody who's been a cabinet minister, somebody who's a leader of one of the parties. Going there, getting an answer, taking down notes about that answer so that you can remind people of what they said, what they promised is really key. And as Sara mentioned, raise it at the door. When a political candidate comes to the door, raise the issue, ask it, remember what they said. And then you can start to get a good feel of what the parties are actually standing for. And some other ways to stay up to date on what's happening during the election is Canada Votes 2019 that I mentioned before on CBC News. It's updated all the time with what the different parties are saying. And I'm sure once the party platforms are actually made public, they will post them there. Follow the candidates and parties on social media because, of course, they're sharing their announcements and what they think is important all the time. And there are also different services that will pull together and amalgamate the different information that's coming out during the election. And you can subscribe to those services and get updates. But just be sure it's an organization that you trust is going to do a good job on that. And lastly, I think what's really important to remember is we tend to focus during an election on the different things that are being said. But really what's said during an election is a suggestion of what might happen. It's not necessarily a promise. During the last election, there were people who promised that there would be a child and youth commissioner, and that has not happened in the last 4 years. So it's really vital that we as child and youth advocates work hard to extract real promises during this time, and we hold people accountable for those promises. And after the election, it's not just that we maintain our advocacy, but we actually intensify our efforts once we know who's in government and we know who to ask and what their priorities are, and we find that sweet spot for what we can push. So some of the key touch points that will be upcoming after the election will be the speech from the throne, where we actually see what they say, and hopefully the ministerial mandate letters are made public because that's very indicative of what the priorities are. And those are tools that we can use to push for what's best for kids. Thank you.
Adele, again, another great presentation, really helping us understand how this whole process works in government and understanding what it is these candidates and the various parties are saying. We did have a question around the webinar for next week that you mentioned around safer medication. So I just put the link there for anyone who's interested in registering for that. And always, you can go to our children'shealthcarecanada.ca website and sign up for our newsletter. Then you'll see when all of our webinars are coming up. But next, we're going to move over to right beside me here in Ottawa, Emily Gruenwoldt, the President and CEO of Children's Healthcare Canada and the Executive Director of the Pediatric Chairs of Canada, to continue the conversation about how we can get involved, how you as Children's Healthcare Canada members and other stakeholders in children's healthcare can get involved in this issue. So over to you, Emily.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here today. And my role today, as Doug mentioned, is to address some of the opportunities Children's Healthcare Canada members and the Pediatric Chairs of Canada have to get involved in the election and to help raise the profile of the issues and the policy priorities that we have heard from you. So first and foremost, our website is a terrific resource, much like the websites that Sara and Adele spoke to as well. We have on our site policy priority one-pagers, which you might have seen on our website or circulated through social media, which really speak to the three priorities that we have identified. So one around child and youth mental health and a pan-Canadian strategy. The second around pursuing reconciliation with respect to Indigenous children and youth health. And lastly, around safer medications and really thinking about a pharmacare strategy through the lens of the unique and special needs of children and youth. So those one-pagers that would help you with some key messages and some quick facts are located on our website. We also have a social media kit, which has some pre-populated tweets that you're seeing at the bottom of your screen, and a few other resources that might help you if you're engaged on social media to really amplify the messages that you've heard today. We also have a pre-populated letter writing campaign tool. You plug in your postal code and up pops your local candidates in your riding. There's a letter there that is a template that you can use or customize as you see fit. Really, again, looking to bring forward issues specific to children's and youth health. We will be working very closely with Adele and the Canadian Pediatric Society on a party platform analysis as soon as we have the 4 platforms available to us. So that will be shared via social media and on our sites, or both of our sites. And as was just mentioned by Doug, we do have a special webinar series planned. This is the first of 4 parts. I'll speak about those and the dates coming up. And last, on our website, we also have links to all the resources that you've heard about today. So the materials that have been prepared by the Canadian Pediatric Society, by UNICEF, Children First Canada, and the Pediatric Chairs of Canada. So the election series, with respect to the webinars, is a 4-part series. The first today was an introduction to what we see as the call to action to elevate children's health as a priority in the context of this 43rd election. And the following 3 webinars really dig deep into the 3 issues, the policy priorities that I just spoke to. So next Wednesday, we'll be speaking about safer medications for children in the context of a pan-Canadian pharmaceutical strategy. On October the 2nd, we'll be talking about how we can pursue reconciliation in the spirit of children's health. And the fourth in the series is around the Pan-Canadian strategy for child and youth mental health. There's much more information about each of these webinars on our website, or if you subscribe to the Spark Conversations blog, this information will show up in your inbox and you can register through the link that is provided. So one of the opportunities that we've heard a few times today is really getting engaged on social media. This is a very easy way for you and your colleagues to amplify some of these key messages. On your screen, you see the Twitter handles of the 4 party leaders, and there's also some relevant hashtags. So these represent both the federal election hashtags, Canadian policy hashtags, but also the specific hashtags reflecting the children's health priorities. So invest in kids, vote for every child, stand up for kids, raising Canada, and if kids could vote. In your community, and Adele covered some of this, absolutely we would encourage you to attend all candidates meetings and elevate children's health as a priority for discussion. Engage in the conversation at the door with your local candidates. Many of the websites that you've just seen include key messages or questions to facilitate a conversation with your local candidates that you might find helpful. Writing letters to local candidates, profiling children's health priorities. Again, there's lots of resources on the CPS site, on the Children First Canada website and Children's Healthcare Canada website. And there's a plethora of resources that you could help us by pitting up in your hospital or in your health organization and thinking about how that can start a conversation with your peers in the hallway. And lastly, to Adele's point as well, submitting questions for the televised leaders debate. The more questions that we have coming in with respect to children's health, the larger our chances are of raising this as an issue. So we certainly encourage you to amplify some of the key messages or some of your own. And lastly, of course, voting is a really significant way to influence the election and to influence the dialogue. I also just want to pick up on Adele's point about post-election. That is such an important point. This is really just the beginning. This is the sprint before the marathon. And really, we encourage you to stay involved post-election. Help us to meet with your candidates in your local ridings and continue to make children's health a priority. So here is a one-page synopsis of the Child Health Partner resources that we think would be helpful for you, relevant for you. There's different tools on each of the websites. And in many cases, there is collaborations between the organizations that you see and have heard today. So at this point, I think I'm going to turn it back to Doug to see if we have any questions from our listeners.
All right. Thank you, Emily, for that great overview of the tools and resources that are available. And this is really something that we heard from our membership, is they wanted Children's Healthcare Canada to play a much more substantial role in advocacy. So these are the kinds of things that we've started doing to make to support you as a member of Children's Healthcare Canada in participating in these activities. So like Emily said, this is your chance to ask a question of the panelists or share your comments or your thoughts. The first question that came in was about, it came in when Sara was speaking. So we'll start with you, Sara, to answer this question. And it's in relation to your call to action or the piece that was related to the Children's Commissioner or the Children's Commission or Commissioner. Knowing that actually all of the organizations that are participating today have played some role in advocating for a children's commissioner of some sort over the past number of years. It's been, on our agendas, on all of our agendas collectively. Is this still a priority at the time? Is there evidence to suggest that this model is relevant? I know we've always based it on the British model. We've always had Sir Al Green come and talk to us about it, and other subsequent children's commissioners from the UK. Is that still a relevant model? Do you think there is any interest in any of the current parties in pursuing this at this time? Can you just give us a sense of where we're at with that whole children's commissioner issue? And Sara, again, we'll start with you.
Yeah, certainly would say that it's still relevant and probably even more important now than it has been in the past. It's based on proven and effective strategies used in more than 60 countries around the world. Children First and UNICEF and CPS and many others have done extensive research on what are the world leading countries doing, the countries that really are topping the charts for children's health, well-being, and the protection of children's rights. And really those leading countries do have commissioners and have proven in countries like the UK and England to have really moved the needle. In England in particular, they moved up the UNICEF Child Wellbeing Index by several points, whereas in Canada we're going backwards rather than forwards. Children First Canada, and as part of our ongoing advocacy efforts, have met with all the major political parties and discussed this and really tried to build the case. Coming back to Adele's point earlier, it was something that the Liberals had campaigned on last time and didn't follow through. And I think one of the big takeaways that many of us have is that it never made it into a mandate letter. And so, that really speaks to the ongoing, we need to be campaigning for this in the election, but even more importantly, post-election, whoever is elected, we need to work to ensure that it's written into a mandate letter and that there's cross-party, all party support. This is really something that should be nonpartisan. We've tried to build the case and articulate the reasons why a commissioner would be helpful, in a nonpartisan way, but also, articulating to each of the parties why it's in their interest and in the interest of all Canadians to do this. The cost of putting in place an office like this is, pales by comparison to what our country is currently spending on maintaining the status quo for having well over a third of our children experiencing an unhealthy childhood. So we continue to make this a high priority and working towards all party support.
Sarah, it's really interesting. When we were visiting different parties, the policy teams over the course of the last several months, our observation was that at one point in time, each of the four major parties have identified this as an opportunity for consideration. And recently this spring, I know you're well aware that there were two different members of parliament who put forward private members' bills speaking to a commission or commissioner, one more focused on children's rights, the other more focused on children's health. So it's an idea that continues to surface. And I think to Doug's point, this is an issue that the four organizations or five organizations on this call today continue to pursue in the best interest of children. So hopefully there's still some runway ahead of us and there's an opportunity post-election.
And Lisa and Adele, don't hesitate to jump in at any time on any of these questions. That goes for all the panelists as we go through this. The next question that came in was related to, and we'll go to Lisa. We'll start with you on this one. It's related to children and the vote, and you've identified that. You had that as one of your hashtags. Every vote counts, or if kids could vote, or that whole campaign that UNICEF is doing around that. The question is just stating that it was recently suggested by a CBC political commentator at a CMA health summit that children's health would never be an election issue, that children do not vote. And because they do not vote, their issues are not seen as a going concern for voters. So you've got this campaign about if children could vote, but yet this person is suggesting that they've heard that, and I think a lot of people have that sentiment that is we can get excited about children's issues if we want, but they don't vote. So if you're going to break an election promise, obviously that would be the one you would break because they don't vote. What do you have to say to that? Like as far as the whole concept of children voting, is that a realistic thing that children would ever vote? And is this issue of them not having a vote really an absolute barrier that's insurmountable as far as getting children's issues to be taken seriously?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question. I think we're seeing increasingly an interest in the part of many stakeholders in Canada to reopen the discussion and debate about the voting age. And growing consensus that that we may in fact be able to move that issue forward. There's lots of debate about to what age the voting age should be lowered, but in any case, at this present time, kids can't vote, but we know that the vast majority of Canadians care deeply about our children. We've done extensive public polling that showed Canadians care about our kids, and that the health and well-being of our children is a high priority for Canadians. So I think that's the whole point of this campaign, and what all of our organizations are speaking to is that it's in our collective well-being to vote and to pressure all federal political leaders to take urgent action for the sake of our children. They represent a quarter of our population, and while they can't currently vote, that it's incumbent on all adults who can to speak up on behalf of our children and for children themselves to speak up and to be heard.
And Doug, if I can just add,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just.
So we just wanted we just wanted to hear from Lisa from UNICEF's perspective on that, since they have that if kids could vote campaign. Lisa,
the vote for every
UNICEF
child.
thinking about that?
Yeah, we have a vote for every child campaign because we do want voters to vote with children in mind. Recognizing that it's their vote, but it's kids' future, and they'll be living with the decisions long after many of us. So. Putting children on the agenda, I think there are actually emerging signs, and you can see some headlines in the last few days that children and youth have suddenly made it onto the federal election agenda. I would say it's a fairly incrementalist approach, but there's a whole range of policy announcements across parties. And if I'm going to be jaded, I would say it's because the suburban voters around certain cities suddenly matter for swinging ridings, and they are largely, families with children. But I would also like to think that there's some recognition that we have some serious challenges in this country around children and youth through the different advocacy initiatives. And, sometimes children can be on a political agenda, an election agenda in the wrong way, as we've also seen in Canada. But I think it's voters need to raise the issues and demand it. And we're not far off from having children take a rightful place. And if kids could vote, they'd certainly have their issues taken more seriously.
Well, you had something you wanted to add to that?
I just wanted to add, it's Marie Adele, I just wanted to add that we have the privilege of working with kids and hearing what their priorities are every day. And until they can vote, we can absolutely bring those issues to the attention of political leaders on their behalf they rightfully should be doing it themselves. But for those of us who are involved in hospitals in some way, shape, or form, almost every pediatric hospital now has a youth advisory council. Maybe every hospital does. And certainly I sit on a committee at CHEO and learn so much from the youth. And it behooves us to hear that and to make sure it's acted upon.
Thank you for that. And we are just looking at the clock. We are pretty much out of time. We do have a few other questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to. So at this point in the session, I did want to just go through, just give each of you just an opportunity for a closing comment or key message you'd like to leave the audience with before we sign off. So we'll just go in the same order. Sara, anything you'd like to leave the audience with? Any other resources or something you'd like to highlight or showcase before we send the audience off?
I think everyone's heard in our joint presentations, we are seeing kids' issues hitting the radar in a way that we haven't seen for some time, but we are far off from seeing the robust commitments that we really need to move the needle for Canada's kids. So just would urge everyone who's taking part in the call to really help us up the ante and keep the pressure up on federal political leaders, on candidates in your riding, and really helping to spread the word and get your friends, colleagues, everyone speaking up on behalf of our children.
You and Lisa, anything you'd like to send the audience off with?
I think just a simple invitation to ask the under 18s in your life. Are they following the campaign? What stands out to them? What would they vote for if they could? What issue? And consider having them influence how you vote.
Right, and Marie Adele.
I would just echo what Sara and Lisa have said, and also encourage people to do this not only during the election, but post October 21st, because that will be vital.
Thank you very much. And finally, for the last word, Emily.
I think that today we've seen a number of resources that are at your disposal, and there's many, many, many different ways to engage depending on your preferences. So I would encourage you to think about what fits for you and how you can support your colleagues and work together to amplify the voice of children and youth.
All right. Thank you again. Thanks, Emily, and to all of our speakers. A great presentation. I think for Children's Healthcare Canada's first crack at this sort of advocacy and during an election season, all that. I think this has really been a great kickoff presentation. It really highlighted the issues. There's really lots of resources from the various organizations that can support us in ways that we have not been supported as individuals who have the opportunity to influence these candidates. So I think this has been a great presentation. So thank you to Sara Austin from Children First Canada, Lisa Wolff from UNICEF Canada, Maria Adele Davis from the Canadian Pediatric Society, and Emily Gruenwoldt from Children's Healthcare Canada and the Pediatric Chairs of Canada. So thank you all for such a great presentation.
Thank you.
All right. So we do our webinars every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and it's always great when you can watch live, as you do get to put in your questions and your comments and really enrich the discussion. But when you can't watch live, we do record these sessions and make them available after the fact on the Knowledge Exchange Network at ken.childrenshealthcarecanada.ca. Next week, we will be continuing this with part 2 of this 4-part election series, where we will be diving into some of the specific areas of interest that Children's Healthcare Canada has identified, and again, bringing in our partners that will be working with on these issues. Next week, September 25th, we'll be welcoming Dr. Charlotte Hepburn-Moore from the Canadian Pediatric Society, Dr. Bob Connolly from the Pediatric Chairs of Canada, and Dr. Andrea Gilpin from the Goodman Centre for Pediatric Formulations based at St. Justine Children's Hospital in Montreal to talk about raising the bar and the path to safer medications for Canadian children, where we'll be looking at overcoming the various challenges about bringing pediatric medications and formulations to Canada, not just the National Pharmacare Plan, but issues around getting medications available to Canadian children that are appropriately tested on the pediatric population, off-label use, and all of those other issues that we struggle with in the healthcare system. So with that said, don't hesitate to sign up for our Children's Healthcare Canada Spark newsletter. You can do that at our website at childrenshealthcarecanada.ca, and that will allow you to stay up to date, not just on our webinars, but all of our activities and events. And again, also don't forget to sign up for the Children's Healthcare Canada annual conference, which is coming up in December. And again, you can find that information on our website. So thanks again for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see many of you back here next week for our next webinar. Bye, everyone.